Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chairman. This evening's debate is on the topic that you cannot legislate against fake news. We put forth the definition that it is impractical and immoral for governing bodies to write laws prosecuting the creation and distribution of fake news. In particular, we'd like to clarify that although the definition of fake news was previously used to describe fabricated news stories, the definition now struggles with ambiguity as it is used to describe any information distributed that does not align with the subject's views, as such is the modern usage of the term. To limit the definition of fake news would not reflect the current usage of the term in society today, as such legislation would aim to target. We would also like to define censorship as the suppression of free speech, as it shall play a prominent role in our team case. As per this definition, we strongly agree that legislation against fake news is immoral and shall have detrimental consequences to the development of society and individuals, as I shall speak on, and that it is impractical to impose legislation which will also serve to threaten diversity of view, as our second speaker, Ellie, shall discuss today. Our third speaker, Annika, will rebut the opposition and conclude our team's case. To begin with, we'd like to clarify that as this topic deals with the cannot and not the should not, by existing legislation, it is literally not possible to legislate against fake news. The Australian Constitution guarantees just 5 rights, but in addition to this, the High Court has declared an implied freedom of political communication, which is essential for the operation of our system of democratic government. If a law is to be permissible, it must be within the constitutional rights and answer 2 questions. Number 1, does the law burden freedom of political communication? And if so, number 2, is the law reasonably appropriate and adapted to serve a legitimate end? Legitimate is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as to be able to be defended with logic and justification. Legislation against fake news is not only illogical, as it is a problem that can be solved through education and awareness, it can also not be justified, because to ban fake news is to impose severe measures on a relatively small problem, as supported by a study published by Stanford University, which detailed the incredibly low persuasion rate of fake news sources. Therefore, by our very constitutional rights, legislation cannot be made against fake news. Although we have clearly detailed why legislation against fake news would not even be able to be passed, on top of this there exist moral dilemmas with applying such laws. Legislation against fake news shall raise the concern of how the abundance of the articles both on the internet and outernet shall be regulated, and who shall oversee enforcing them. As we found issues in defining the very term fake news, we believe this to be yet another area of subjectivity that shall arise with legislation against fake news. Fake news has become a term thrown around to discredit material that is created to either have an impact, mislead, or damage a reputation. However, the way in which this shall be distinguished from the truth is yet to be determined. The truth in itself is often disputed in areas such as religion, the supernatural, conspiracy theories, and many more. So how is it possible to separate stubborn opinions from intended lies? What makes fake news different to real news? It depends on your perspective, a subjectivity on which legislation should not be created. And what about late-night TV sketches, parodies, satire, sarcasm? How can any algorithm created to regulate news tell from Obama wasn't born in America to, yeah, Obama wasn't born in America? So some people, as it is, they have trouble identifying sarcasm, and yet this will have to be enacted not just once or twice a day, but according to web content statistics, on the over 2 million articles published every single day. Techniques such as satire and derision contribute to the very way in which we communicate, and to enforce sanctions would suppress such creative license. Perhaps as society progresses with the development of technology and therefore mass media communication, our discernment should adapt, just as we have already learnt not to click the Adelaide mum makes 1k a day and so can you link, for we know it is clickbait. Society needs to be learned to allow how to tell fake news from the truth for themselves, just as we have already begun to, as it shall always remain essential for the individual to methodically identify and discern the value of sources for themselves, a valuable skill both on and offline. Legislation should be made to protect and defend rights, not to suppress them and foster ignorance and lack of judgment. Therefore, legislation against fake news cannot be made, as it shall threaten these very values. In addition, legislating fake news will create a culture of censorship, one which we must take great care to avoid, as George Orwell's novel 1984 teaches us, in a story about a dystopian government which oppresses any individuality or opposition, as Ellie shall elaborate on later. This is not to say that legislation against fake news shall plunge us into an eternal totalitarian state, but rather to warn us against possible consequences that society shall reap from a step towards what is essentially censorship. As the journalism professor of the University of the Philippines said, fake news law is like burning down the house to kill a cockroach. It's a very, very extreme measure, and we don't want censorship in the media to be the solution to curbing false information. It all boils down to self-regulation, media literacy, and media education. And this is the moral and sensible should not to the clearly existing cannot. In conclusion, legislation against fake news is not only legislated against, but it opposes critical thinking and artistic license, the same freedom to write which gave us Orwell's fantastic 1984, a story that cautions against censorship if we want to maintain a society where the voice of the individual is not only heard, but it matters. And I fear the day that we debate it doesn't. So as Abraham Lincoln tweeted in the 15th century, not everything you find on the internet is real. And in this age of spoon-fed, on-demand information, it is to our benefit to learn to discern the truth from lies for ourselves, to allow democracy and morality to prosper. Thank you.
I call upon the first negative speaker, Amy Talbot.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Madam Chairman and Timekeeper. The topic for our debate today is that you cannot legislate against fake news. We, the negative team, believe that this is false. We disagree with the definition provided by the affirmative team, as it is still defined as false information, however some may use it incorrectly. We define fake news as a type of journalism or propaganda that consists of deliberate misinformation or hoaxes spread by traditional print and broadcast news media or online social media. We define to legislate against as to create laws and regulations that prevent and control an action or occurrence. We define can as to be able to. The opposition has tried to tell you that fake news is a small issue, so why are Americans so fed up about it regarding their election? They said that censorship can remove freedom of speech, however we are not banning satire, just false information that is intended to mislead. They also said that satire is fake news. This is incorrect because satire is a completely different category, making their statement irrelevant, and I will elaborate on this later in my speech. They also tried to say that legislation means banning, however this is not the case. As the first speaker of the negative team, I will talk to you about media outlets and broadcasting laws, as well as satire versus fake news. Our second speaker, Shifang, will provide you with arguments regarding the enforcement of these laws. Our last speaker, Harriet, will rebut and sum up our case. Okay, on to my first argument. In Australia, all media outlets are only allowed to publish articles and information if the government allows it. This means that the government has a responsibility to monitor the media and therefore control, prevent, and remove fake news. But me publishing fake news is a private act, you might say. But sorry, you're wrong. All major media outlets need a government-issued license in order to publish, therefore making them the business of the government and therefore the public, as is the government not elected for and by the public. This tells us that the media is not a private enterprise, but a public one. Consequently, publishing fake news is making use of public airways, making it a public act. We accept that news outlets play a big part in today's society, and if the government is to license those who abuse that influence by publishing fake news, the government must take responsibility and must legislate against fake news. This is just in Australia, however, and fake news is a global issue. Many countries do not have licensing laws, but that does not free their governments from responsibility. Ronald Reagan, 40th President of the United States of America, is quoted as having said, "Government's first duty is to protect the people." More recently, Barack Obama said, "If the people cannot trust their government to do the job for which it exists, to protect them and to promote their common welfare, all else is lost." What does this tell you? Part of a government's duty in protecting their people is to ensure that they are protected from lies. If someone knowingly broadcasts false information, this can violate the laws of the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. The rules of the FCC stop people with broadcasting licenses from publishing or broadcasting false information concerning a catastrophe or crime if the licensee is known that beforehand that the information is false, and it is known that broadcasting the information could cause substantial public harm. Public harm means that either, and I quote from fcc.gov, the public harm, one, okay, I'll have to skip that. Oh, no, it is here. Yeah, must. Oh. Never mind. Now on to satire and how it is different from fake news. People are very quick to confuse the two since they are similar, but it is made for very different reasons. Satire is the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to criticize people's stupidity or vices as a form of entertainment. Fake news, on the other hand, is intentionally misleading content that is used to gain attention. In this situation, intention is defined by the same rules that surround premeditation and other legal situations. Another way to look at this, remember, we send people to live their lives in prison by analyzing the opinions of us everyday, rational people. Life sentences. In America, they send people to their deaths based on the rationale of 12 people. Surely we can differentiate between satire and fake news. And we can. So in conclusion, we, the negative team, hope that you can believe that we can legislate against fake news and it is different from satire. Thank you.
I call upon the second affirmative speaker, Eleanor Teo.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that you cannot legislate against fake news. As the affirmative team, we strongly agree with this statement. However, first I would like to point out some flaws in the opposition's points. The negative team has disagreed with our definition of fake news. However, we would like to argue that fake news is such an ambiguous phrase which needs more than just a narrow definition as provided by the negative team. Their provided definition only covers a small part of what today is more commonly known as fake news. In today's colloquial term, fake news could cover anything from false narratives issued by governments, satire, or even poetic license, especially with such blurry lines and possibilities of accidental interpretation. So we believe that our definition of fake news is a much more accurate representation of fake news with the ambiguity of the term, and is also why we believe that you cannot legislate against fake news. The first speaker has said that the government should be in charge of all news being put out. However, we cannot give legislators the power to choose what constitutes fake and true. As our first speaker, Emma, has mentioned, the ambiguity of fake news makes it extremely hard to decide how to control fake news. So giving an immense power, such as being able to decide what fake news is an extremely dangerous possibility, much greater than the original core of fake news. When our politicians and leaders are given the opportunity to determine the unflattering news article they read as fake news and any articles that suit them as alternative facts, our society has gone too far. Our first speaker, Emma, has looked at the moral consequences of oppressive legislations on individuals and society. Today, I will be talking about 2 points looking at the practicality of legislating against fake news. Firstly, that a legislation against fake news causes problems in not only the written act, but also politics. And secondly, that with the unfathomable capacity of the internet, there is no way to control all fake news. My first point is that a legislation against fake news would be an impossibility when trying to put the act down in writing, even just in the political sense as I will be looking at. Legislations would lead to no more than a disrupted society, and thus would serve as no cure to the problems surrounding fake news. Because yes, we agree that there may be some problems surrounding fake news. However, with fake news or even without fake news or even with a legislation over fake news, the consequences become far too significant, causing more harm than good. There have been many recent proposals trying to ban fake news. However, from these there have been no practical propositions made. For example, in March of 2017, the California Assembly's Committee on Privacy and Consumer Affairs were to consider a censorship bill to ban fake news, covering politics, yet with no prevail. In short, the proposed bill read, "It is unlawful for a person to knowingly and willingly make or cause to be made any writing posted on an internet website being false, deceptive, or designed to influence the vote on A, any issue submitted to voters at an election, or B, any candidate for election to public office." With this in mind, banning political fake news would make it illegal to have any personal opinion on the internet, which could be an influence in the voting of an election. This leaves any politician unable to express their views without fear of this legislation. Does this now mean that the 50 people retweeting a politician's tweet have in fact broken the law? Clearly, there are many problems surrounding the legislations against fake news, with much of political speech being built around influencing voters with misleading and false facts. But not only this, we can see throughout the whole of politics a history of unfair deceptions and twisted truths, all with the goal of influencing voters. From the Hamilton-Jefferson feud of the late 1700s to the more recent Trump-Clinton feud. With the legislation against fake news, political speech would turn into a blame game, with accusations flying at any hyperbole or errors. To put a blanket ban on fake news, or even just political fake news, would ultimately lead to chaos in terms of democracy, which thrives on differing opinions and statements. And as for the voters, there have been extensive studies showing that fake news has very little influence on how they vote. This can be seen in a study on social media and fake news by economists Hunt Alcott and Matthew Jenskow, where it was found that exposing voters to one additional TV campaign ad during the 2016 election changed the vote shares by an estimated 0.02%. Not only this, but it was also found that only 14% of people are influenced by what they see on social media, thus showing the impacts fake news can have to be so small and nowhere near as extreme as many claim it to be. And so you cannot legislate against fake news, as fake news is not necessarily the problem we must face. Moving on to my second point of impracticality, that with the sheer scope and speed of the internet, there is no way to truly eradicate all fake news. Simply Googling fake news leads to 141 million results in 0.55 seconds. This is an amazing amount of data in such a limited time. However, the harm coming from our great and efficient technology ultimately causes an inescapable realm of fake news. In today's society, the internet holds a multitude of outlets in which fake news can be spread, leading to a near impossibility when it comes to keeping fake news off all these outlets. On Facebook alone, there are 4.75 billion pieces of content shared each day. With over 1,870 million active users on the site, small pieces of fake news can be spread from a specific demographic of people to an epidemic across the site. These surges of misinformation are happening constantly and are impossible to keep track of, because once out there, no legislation could ever stop the fake news from circulating. And yes, we do agree that this growing trend cannot be ignored, as it would be negligent to do so. As our first speaker, Emma, has already mentioned, the way to fix these problems of fake news is through education, through educating our society to think critically and in a way so that we can methodically identify fake news. To conclude, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, the problem with criminalising fake news is that it has the potential to dissuade individuals from expressing their opinions for fear of being persecuted. And as Shakespeare wrote in his blog, I Heart Julius Caesar, this fault is not in our legislation, dear Brutus, but in ourselves, that thee canst not determine Trump's lies from moral truths. And so we, the affirmative team, believe that fake news cannot be legislated against.
I call upon the second negative speaker, Stefan Liu.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, chairman and adjudicator. I'm Shafang, the second speaker of the negative team, and I'm here to talk to you regarding how we will go about enforcing legislation against fake news, as well as summing up our first speaker's incomplete points, unfortunately. Now, before I start, I'd like to have a few comments regarding the affirmative team's points. They stated that our definition was narrow, however it is not narrow. Their definition would have been more narrow, as they immediately started saying that fake news is bad, and a definition is supposed to be an unbiased and straightforward statement explaining the topic, not their own argument. They also said that enforcing legislation against fake news would be impractical. We will go about seeing that as I talk about enforcement later in my speech. For Trump, one man's words do not change the official definition. They are trying to incorporate satire, but Amy has already stated that they are very different things. Also, we are not trying to ban fake news. It is only legislation regarding it, against it, including controlled distribution as an option, not banning it. Exposing their audience in a test to an additional ad campaign ad can make a 0.02% difference to their judgment. However, that campaign ad could also be only a 0.02 difference increase in the information that they receive. The study never stated how many campaign ads they have already watched, so 0.02 difference is not much, or can be a lot, depending on how your audience has been watching the news. Now to Amy's points. If someone knowingly broadcasts false information, this can violate the laws of the FCC, as she has already stated. The rules are quoted from here, quoted from the fcc.gov website. Public harm is defined as must begin immediately and cause direct and actual damage to property or the health or the safety of the general public, or to divert law. If the licensee uses a disclaimer that clearly states that the program to be fiction, and it is presented in a reasonable way under the circumstances, then the program will be presumed to pose no foreseeable public harm. This proves that it is the government's responsibility to protect its people against fake news. We can and must legislate against fake news. Well, how would you actually go about enforcing legislation regarding fake news? Tracing internet profiles can be challenging, I admit, but the systems we have already today is already being used to track criminal activity, using unintentional leaks from the end user. This information leaks can be used to link accounts together, so you know which user has which profiles on which accounts, on which sites. Individual devices are also assigned an Internet Protocol address, or IP, as they connect to the Internet immediately before. This string of numbers and letters are easily traceable, so you can monitor a specific device's activity and track them back. These IP addresses are easily tracked, and once any information that can be identified as a company or an individual associated with a company, they can be prosecuted. Most social media outlets already track you based on your IP to provide you location information and tailor data specifically to you. Giants like Facebook and Google already have this in the terms of use, not that anyone reads them. Well, how does this all work? Well, you track the IP's activity, and the moment you notice an email that matches one in your database from your government, say from your census or something similar, then you have the identity of a person linking back to their social media profiles. Well, what about VPNs, or virtual private networks, things that use to hide and scramble Internet Protocol addresses? Simple enough, a firewall is enough to block it, and it's easier and cheaper said than done, at least relatively speaking. A good example is China's Golden Shield project, which is to block any VPN connection by scanning or sniffing data packets for any odd signatures that don't relate to the normal HTTP protocol. Why not prosecute individuals that access the sites instead of prosecuting news outlets? This would mean that you are tracking low-profile individuals, thousands, even millions of them, over long periods of time, perhaps sometimes even years or decades, to get the information needed, rather than just a handful of media outlets who publish information daily. Prosecuting a high-profile entity would send a message to the public, as well as any other media outlets, that fake news is a serious matter and we will prosecute you. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, chairman and adjudicator, we can most definitely see that enforcement, while it might seem complicated and troublesome at first, is actually almost easy thanks to the tracking already in place. Tracing profiles to real people is also being almost laughably easy. due to the amount of personally identifiable information that we now place, such as profiles of pictures of yourself, your friends, or family members. Physical enforcement would proceed similar to what we have today, like how we deal with drug dealers or other people that break the law. Enforcement is almost easy. Thank you.
I call upon the third affirmative speaker, Annika Chura-Seven.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that you cannot legislate against fake news. We, the affirmative team, believe this statement to be true. The other team has disagreed with our definition and stated that our definition was too narrow. Ladies and gentlemen, arguing that fake news can simply be defined as articles that are knowingly false in their entirety and published with the express intent to mislead is incorrect. This definition only works if you're talking about a fake news publisher trying to generate revenue off of ads. However, the waters become murkier when you're trying to talk about governments issuing false narratives intending to mislead the public and news outlets that reprint those. In addition to this, we must also consider satirical humour and poetic licence, both of which are commonly used in the press and could accidentally be interpreted as fake news. Even when combining all of these elements, this narrow definition of fake news covers just a small percentage of the false and misleading statements that are published every day around the world. And so we believe our broader definition, while still not covering every possibility, is more accurate than the narrowly defined oppositions. And this is also why we believe you cannot legislate against fake news and it cannot truly be defined. They also said that they defined legislate as regulate and not to ban. The other team refuses to accept our definition of legislation and insists we must regulate it. However, they failed to provide any examples of how it would be possible to do so in any way other than to ban it. And so we would like to say that our definition of legislation is more accurate. The first speaker talked about how we must protect the people. We agree that the people's right to freedom of political communication should be protected. We also believe that the people's capacity to evaluate sources for themselves should also be protected. And thus, legislation against fake news would be ineffective in protecting these values. They have also stated that fake news is only allowed if the government allows it. Yet they have also defined fake news as misleading information spread through social media, an international outlet which does not require the government's approval each time anything is posted by its millions of daily users. This is a contradiction and also highlights how fake news cannot be legislated. The first speaker talked about how satire is not fake news. We disagree, as under our definition, satire is included as fake news. And additionally, while we as humans may be able to tell the difference between satire and facts, surely the other team does not propose that we employ millions of people to check the difference between a satirical article or a factual one. The only other option would be to use an algorithm that detects the difference between factual and satirical statements. However, it would not be an effective way to combat fake news, as the line between factual and subjective statements can sometimes easily be blurred. For example, as our first speaker said, the use of sarcasm can turn a factual statement into a subjective statement and could thus avoid detection from the algorithm. Furthermore, even if we were to employ millions of people to trawl through the millions of articles published each day, we would be placing disclarity on the subjectivity of many different people's opinions, with varying political stances and opinions. And this is why we believe that not only is satire fake news, but there is also no way to possibly legislate it. The second speaker has said that fake news must be legislated against. While the idea behind legislating fake news is born from good intentions, the fact of the matter is that you cannot fight fake news with a bad law, if any law at all. To highlight this, I would like to bring to your attention a proposed law in California. The proposed law reads, "It is unlawful for a person to knowingly and willingly make or publish or circulate on an internet website or to cause, be made, published or circulated in any writing posted on an internet website a false or deceptive statement designed to influence the vote on either of the following: A, any issue submitted to voters at an election, or B, any candidate for the election to public office." In other words, it would be illegal or incorrect on the internet if it could impact an election. This law is one of many that have been proposed and are completely unconstitutional, as stated by our first speaker. If this law were to be passed, people could be accused for the slightest hint of hyperbole, exaggeration, poetic license, or common error. Furthermore, this law makes no exception for satire or parody, nor does it exempt any news organisations who quote deceptive statements made by politicians in their online reporting, even if their reporting is meant to debunk those claims. This is merely an example of how a bad law will be more of an issue than fake news itself, and how instead of trying to fight fake news with legislation, we should be fighting it with education. In conclusion, to summarise my team's case, our first speaker, Emma, highlighted how it is not only literally against our constitutional rights to legislate against fake news, but there also exist moral and ethical dilemmas in doing so. Our second speaker, Ellie, talked to us about how legislation against fake news is impossible to compose in writing and also causes political issues in attempting to do so. She also talked about how there is no possible way to control the unfathomable capacity of the internet with simple legislation. In conclusion, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, as Socrates said in 2011 with the endorsement of the Pope, in the fight against lies, the government must not create tools to suppress the truth. And so we believe, regardless of the fact that we cannot legislate against fake news, we simply should not. Thank you.
third negative speaker, Harriet Ford.
Good evening, Chair, Adjudicator, ladies and gentlemen. As you well know by now, the topic for tonight's debate is that you cannot legislate against fake news. We, the negative team, strongly disagree with this statement. The opposition has disagreed with our definition. While they are adamant that a wider definition is required, I stand firm on the statement that satire and other humorous content must be exempted from this definition. I also raise the idea that despite a definition needing to be unbiased, the inclusion of satire and creative media in their definition, when they are very clearly not, is blurring the line between bias and non-bias. Now, on to my summaries. You can and should legislate against fake news. Fake news is a poisonous medium that, if is not outrightly slanderous, is at least scandalous in order to promote interest. Amy has already explained to you that the government has a responsibility to legislate against fake news, that not only can we legislate, but we must, as it is part of the government's purpose. A government exists in order to protect the people who elected them and whom they serve. Part of this protection is protecting the government from lies and falsehoods. In other words, fake news. In countries such as Australia, where media outlets need a broadcasting license or media license in order to produce media, it is even more so the government's responsibility, as they are compelled to monitor the media that they allow to be published and produced. The government can and must legislate against fake news. As Amy also said, fake news and satire are different, very different. Satire is news or content written or presented with the intent of humour. Fake news, on the other hand, is written with the intent to deceive. Now you may ask, how can we prove intention? Well, in the court of law, specific intent is defined as the intent to achieve a specific result. A person acts intentionally with respect to a result when his or her conscious objective is to cause such result. In this case, specific intent is producing fake news as to deceive and manipulate the audience into believing the lies they are spreading. While general intent is defined as the intent to engage in contact, in this case, to produce fake or deceiving content masquerading as news. Using these definitions, intent can be proved in a court of law, whether this intent is to commit murder or to produce fake news. With this differentiation in intent, we are able to define the difference between fake news and satire, which then enables us to legislate against fake news. Well, now that we've resolved the fact that we are able to differentiate between satire and other media with humorous intentions and fake news, the issue now stands as to how to enforce and penalise fake news. Many people believe that they can hide behind a screen when writing or posting things online, but they are all kidding themselves. Shifang detailed that in fact almost all information online can be tracked thanks to Google, Facebook and other companies recording information such as names, emails and phone numbers. Not only that, but information can also be traced back to an IP address, which is a personal identifier for all devices using an internet network. As a device must be connected to the internet in order to publish online, the information can be traced back to its source, enabling prosecution. However, not all fake news is published on social media platforms like Facebook or Twitter, but quite often fake articles are published on seemingly legitimate news sites. In this case, the publisher would be prosecuted. This would mean that publishers would think twice before publishing any article or information that could be deemed fake. Once a few have been charged and convicted, others would be deterred. This creates an effective barrier and would prevent fake news from reaching the public. Now, the first opposition has tried to tell you that legislating against fake news is impractical and oppresses creativity. This is wrong because creativity is not a right. Freedom of speech, maybe, but we already have defamation laws. If legislation against fake news is oppressing freedom of speech, are defamation laws not? Satire is also exempt from this, as fake news and satire are different. As to her point that it suppresses creativity, is telling lies a creative outlet that we really should be encouraging? I think not. Children are scolded, punished even, from a young age, yet here we are saying that we should not create laws preventing internet trolls from lying and misleading innocent people. The opposition have also tried to tell you that we cannot use an algorithm to differentiate between creative satire and fake news. But as I said previously, can we not use as Shifang said previously, can we not use a similar setup as to juries in a murder trial? Surely that is a much bigger issue, yet you rely on man's opinion. This can be done so in the case of proving intent, if the debate so requires. The second opposition speaker has tried to tell you that we cannot legislate against fake news as it is oppressive. As I said before, If fake news legislation is oppressive, are defamation laws not also? No, they protect, as would fake news legislation. She also raised the issue that fake news cannot be controlled due to its social media presence, but as Shafang said, we only need to make an example of the few in order to deter the many. Furthermore, we don't necessarily have to punish the people who share fake news, just the people who produce it. You say that not everyone believes fake news, but how are we expecting to, oh so simply, educate people to look around it? Over time, it grows into a massive issue, and it is better to eradicate, or at least control it, while it is still small. The opposition also said that education will end fake news. While this may work with issues such as safe sex or drug education where ignorance is in play, in this case it will not address the core problem, which like a fungus would spread, poisoning until one of our key outlets, the media, is poisoned and oppressed by fake news. We condemn those in dictatorships who oppress the media, but if action is not taken, this is what will happen to us, a supposedly free country. So, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, despite the opposition's best efforts to convince you otherwise, you can legislate against fake news. Thank you.